Hi Dragonflies, welcome back to Dragonfly Spirit Studio. I'm Lynn Bauer. I'm back with another postcard video, but this is not exactly a paint-along. When you watch a paint-along, you're coming in at the point where we're really kind of ready to just cross the finish line and execute a plan that somebody else has already come up with and tested and refined and kind of gotten all the bugs out of. And that's fine if what you're looking for today is just an opportunity to play with the materials and not have to think very much, or if you're approaching this as a craft project today and you're focused on the outcome. I just want something colorful for that corner of my kitchen, or I want to send a get well card before my friend recovers, waiting for me to come up with a plan for it. But I know that many of you also aspire to eventually creating paintings of your own design that say something personally meaningful or use colors and styles and techniques that resonate with you. So in this video, I'm going to try to take a step back and give you at least one picture of what the planning process might look like. Before we begin, a couple of caveats about how to use this video. Most of the time, planning and the development of a creative idea are taught in an interactive setting, a class or a coaching or mentoring relationship or picking the brains of other artists, because one of the hard parts about learning to plan paintings for yourself is learning to push yourself through that uncertainty of, I don't really know what I'm doing here. So I can't play that role for you in a self-study format if you're watching this on your own, and that means you have to do that for yourself. So if you really want to learn to plan paintings that are your own design, I encourage you to actually pause the video at the places where I suggest you do that and give the various steps a try. If you watch this video and just say to yourself, oh, your ideas are better than anything I would ever come up with, I'll just do what you're doing, that's fine, but you're not going to learn very much about the planning process. It's kind of like saying you're going to learn to drive a car by watching other people drive. Yes, you do pick up some ideas about how it works by watching other people drive, but you're never really going to develop those actual skills for yourself until you get behind the wheel. So I encourage you to get behind the wheel and actually try the various steps in this video. Also, because planning and development of a creative idea are usually taught in an interactive setting, most of the self-study materials that you're used to seeing, the videos that you watch and the books that you read, and that I'm used to creating, are about the technical aspects of watercolor. In this video, we want to take a big step back and not get too down in the weeds about how did we do that particular technique. So to keep us both on track and help us focus our attention on the planning process and how that worked and not get caught up in technique, I'm going to make a rule that I'm calling my don't ask because I won't tell policy. And by that I mean, don't send me emails saying, hey, would you explain what you were doing at that particular step where you tried that one little technique? You only showed a little bit of it and I'm excited about it. I don't want your attention there, and I don't want my attention there. I need to be thinking about how to articulate why I'm making the decisions I'm making and how I'm figuring out what this plan is going to be, and not how do I explain how to do this technique. Now, that doesn't mean that there might not at some point be a video, or in many cases already is a video about that technique, but don't send me email requesting it or asking me to explain further, because I just won't respond to that. And that's not because I'm trying to keep these techniques a big secret. It's because I want to keep your attention and my attention on the planning process in this video and not on all the little technical details. So with that said, let's get started trying to plan a holiday card. This is a point where I could pull out my studio notebook and start working in there on brainstorming, but I find that I'm more likely to be free with my ideas in the initial phase if I use a piece of scrap paper. When I get farther along in the process, I usually will go to my studio notebook, but often at this point I just pull something out of recycling and flip it over and work on the back. For the purposes of the video, I'm using a digital app just because it shows up a little better on the screen. So we're starting off with the initial concept of a holiday card, but this initial concept is too vague. It's not an actual plan that we can paint from. For one thing, we need to pin down what holiday we're talking about. Now, I'm releasing this in mid-December, and I grew up celebrating Christmas, so I'm going to plan a Christmas card because part of what we're going to do is rely on our own memories and associations. But you could use this same planning process for any holiday. But of course, it's not enough just to say Christmas card. I still need to develop and refine this initial concept. Since we've all been learning mostly online lately, our conditioned response is to go search on YouTube for watercolor Christmas card in this case. But since we want to try to design a card of our own, we're going to hold off on that step. And instead, we'll use a creative response. We'll brainstorm what images capture the holiday feelings I want to convey. Now, this can feel overwhelming. We're used to being asked things like what memories capture the holiday feelings we might want to convey, but not images. And immediately we start thinking, oh, there are too many possibilities, or I don't know what I want to convey, and anyway, I don't know how to translate that into an image. Or I can't think of anything that isn't a cliche, and anyway, I couldn't paint any of my ideas. So when your brain starts turning all this out, take a deep breath and remind yourself that this is actually normal. And this is where we're going to try to start cultivating that ability to be comfortable with that uncertain feeling of, I don't know what I'm doing. One strategy for coping with this is to direct your attention to some more helpful thoughts. For example, remind yourself you can say something meaningful and delightful without being original. Sometimes we get stuck because we make too big a deal of coming up with something that's never been seen before in the history of the world. And we can design our own paintings simply by giving our own take on a traditional subject. To help yourself narrow down the possibilities, you can ask, what holiday memories or associations do you share with the intended recipient for this card? Postcards make a great place to start learning this planning process because one thing that can really help you design your own paintings is to have a specific person in mind as the intended recipient of the painting. Ask yourself, how do you want this card to make that person feel? And you probably know that person well enough to make some pretty good guesses about what shared memories would do that job. So in my case, I've refined my concept to something more specific about Christmas trees or ornaments. I'm not sure what yet. Everything from going out into a snowy landscape to choose a tree or decorate an outside tree to decorating a tree indoors, but something to do with Christmas trees is where I want to go. Okay, at this point, I invite you to pause the video and try to refine that initial concept a bit, come up with an idea for your holiday card, think about the memories and feelings you want to invoke for the recipient, and don't worry yet about whether you know how to paint it. Don't overthink it, give it a minute or two at most. You can always change your mind later. And by the way, even though I cautioned you against just copying whatever I'm doing, that doesn't mean that you can't also choose to do something related to Christmas trees or ornaments. There will still be plenty of opportunities for you to give it your own take. So now we have a more specific concept, but it's still not specific enough to be an actual plan for a painting. So we need to refine it further and start coming up with a plan. At this point, it's often helpful to start considering, what do I already know how to do that I can exploit? And how much am I willing to experiment? How much time and energy do I have? If I have an idea that I really want to pursue, I'm not going to rule it out at this point because I don't know how to do it, but I am going to start thinking about whether I'm up for it right now. At this point, I invite you to pause the video and think a moment about whether there are things you already know how to do that you could exploit to express your concept, and also how much experimenting you want to do, how much time and energy you have. The direction you go might depend on whether you're doing this mostly just for your own fun, and if it turns out you'll mail it, or you really want to make a dozen different postcards to send out by next weekend. At this point, we could be going in literally millions of directions collectively, and I can't tailor this video to fit everybody's situation. So I just want to put in a little reminder that this is not a video about a planning process that works for every single person and every single painting. Just as you would not expect in one 20 or 30-minute video to learn every technique about how to apply watercolor to paper, you also will not learn in one 20 or 30-minute video a planning strategy that works for every single painting and every single artist. So what I'm doing here is giving you an example. So the hypothetical situation I'm going to work on is, let's imagine that I'm relatively new to watercolor and I don't have a lot of skills yet. Or perhaps I'm an experienced painter and I don't have a lot of time and energy. I want to crank out a dozen of these by next weekend and get them in the mail. So now it's time to play a little game of what if. As in, what if I make it as simple as possible? Up to this point, I've focused most of my attention on what I want to express. Now I'm starting to think about how I'm going to do that. So I'm going to think in images and techniques. Now, making it as simple as possible means different things to different people. I don't want to make the image too complicated, but I also want to think about what do I know how to do that I feel confident about. So let's suppose I've done the watercolor jumpstart lesson on trees. I've done the full moon over the forest postcard paint along that showed me some ideas for tree silhouettes and also moonlight. I did the eggs in a glass bowl postcard paint along, but I found it kind of hard, but I might be able to use it to do ornaments, and I can definitely fill in a shape with color. Up till now, we've planned mostly in words, but now I'm going to shift to making little drawings. Sometimes people call these thumbnail studies, but I like to just call them exploratory drawings or scribble drawings, because at this point, these are not studies. It's just a visual list of the ideas that I've come up with. It doesn't really have to look like anything much at this point. It's just supposed to remind me of the various ideas that I came up with. I did start by thinking about how do I keep it simple and use what I already know how to do, but when I start generating thumbnails, I allow myself to just imagine anything that I think might be a good image, because I might decide that this isn't good for this year, but next year, maybe when I have more experience, this would be a great idea for a card. I also use words to help me out if I think I won't remember what those little dots are, for example. Okay, now it's your turn. Some tips. Imagine or visualize the image on the card first, and then make a scribble drawing that's just enough to remind you of that idea. Use a few words if you need to help with reminding yourself, and don't worry too much about trying to evaluate the ideas yet. Just generate them. You may generate some really great ideas that you're not quite ready to paint, but you can save them for another time. Okay, now that I've let my imagination run wild, it's time to come back to reality and ask myself, what is reasonable with the time and energy and experience that I have? I'm actually pretty excited about some of these ones that involve the trees on a snow-covered landscape, but I don't feel confident about painting snow. But that's okay, because I have some great ideas now to work towards for next year, and something to kind of direct what technical skills I want to put on my list of things to learn. And I also have some great ideas for this year. The first one is a little too simple for my taste. I kind of like the second and third, maybe not sure about how to arrange them. The fourth one I really like, especially if I make it kind of funky and stylized so I don't have to try to make it too real. And I actually also kind of like that last one. And even though I am imagining that as a snow-covered landscape, if it's really dark and there are just some stars in the sky and it's only illuminated by starlight and it's mostly a silhouette, I think I might be able to pull it off using the techniques from the full moon over the forest postcard paint along. So I decide that the fourth one and the last one, I'm going to try a little bit of experimenting and see how I feel after I get brush on paper about whether I can pull that off. Okay, it's your turn again. Pause the video and cross off any of the ideas that aren't exciting to you. Make note of some that might be great ideas for another time but not feasible for now, and try to identify 2 or 3 that look manageable and appealing enough to keep exploring. Next, I'm going to take one of these ideas for design and ask myself, what do I still need to figure out before I actually have a plan that allows me to do this painting? At this point, basically, I just need to figure out the answers to these questions, and I'm ready to make a plan to start doing this painting. So first I ask myself, do I want to do that little pot at the bottom, or do I want to make it a tree skirt? And pretty quickly I decide it's going to be a pot because I'm trying to keep this simple, and I'm just going to make a little trapezoid and fill it in with some red. As far as colors, I decide I'm going to do just red and green. I play around a little bit with the colors on my palette till I find a red and a green that I like. And then I mess around with some different ways of creating the ornaments. I could just paint them, I could draw little circles and fill them in, but then I realized, oh, I could take the end of a pencil and maybe I could stamp them. And I try that and it works. So now I feel like I have an actual plan for how I'm going to execute this painting. And I know I might encounter some things I haven't thought of yet, so I'm going to try this first on the back of just a scrap piece of paper and see how it goes. So at this point I draw an actual thumbnail sketch that's got the right proportions to see how I want to position things on the page. And I write down some notes to myself about how I'm going to execute this painting. So at this point, I have an actual plan for how I'm going to go about executing this painting. And I've at least tried to anticipate the challenges that I'll encounter and figure out the answers to those questions ahead of time, so I'm ready to paint. All right, it's your turn again. Try to figure out what challenges you might anticipate or questions you have to answer, problems to solve before you're ready to paint. Look for a solution to each one. You might need to do some experimenting, or you might need at this point to do some research and see what other artists have done. Make yourself a thumbnail sketch that gives you a roadmap to where you're going to place things and some notes about how you're going to proceed through your painting. And away I go. I've figured out my colors, I've figured out the sequence that I'm going to do things, I know what techniques I'm going to use, so I just jump in and start painting. Now, as I go, I may discover some things I didn't anticipate. When I get down to the bottom and I start painting the pot, I realize I'm not sure if I like it being quite this flat, so I decide impulsively to go ahead and add a little bit of shadow to it. After all, it only took me about 15 seconds to paint that tree, so if I add the shadow and I don't like it, it's not a big deal. I can just start over. In fact, I do like it, so that's great. As I am adding the ornaments, I realize I didn't really wait for that green to dry, and some of it's running, and I also didn't leave a lot of space, and so to get enough ornaments, I'm having to stamp right on top of the green, and I don't know if that's going to work. So I can just go ahead and do it. There's not that much time invested, so if it doesn't work, again, I can just start over. In fact, it seems to be working just fine, so I keep stamping. At this point, I've executed my plan, and it's not bad. I kind of like it. But it feels like it needs a little bit more, so I decide to go ahead and try adding a star on the top with a gold gel pen. Again, with so little time invested in the actual execution, I feel like I can take a chance, and if I mess this one up, it won't be that hard to create another one that will be just as nice or maybe better. I think I like it with the gold star, so I could just say, okay, this is it. I'm going to go ahead and paint the other dozen that I need to mail out. Or I can say, you know, I think I want to explore that other idea and just see how I feel about it. As a way to review the process, let's go ahead and try this same thing for the other idea that we had. Once again, I'm going to start by asking myself, what do I still have to figure out before I have an actual plan for executing this painting? Well, I'm not sure how I'm going to handle the stars. I think maybe spattering masking fluid will work. And I don't know if the snow should be lighter or darker than the sky. If I don't have a starry night and some snow right outside my door right now, this is a point where I might go to an image service like Google Images or Unsplash and look at a variety of photos of night skies and snow. One thing I noticed when I did that is a lot of them have been photoshopped extensively, or there is artificial light on the snow, so it didn't really answer my question. So I'm going to have to experiment with this. And then I also need to figure out what colors I want to use. There's enough complication in this already. I think I will keep it pretty monochrome and maybe just use the color mixtures that I already learned in that full moon over the forest paint along that I already did. So at this point, again, I have a plan for executing. I'm not as confident of this plan as the other one, but I sort of feel like I have to try it to figure out what's working and what isn't. So again, it's time to dive right in. I start by spattering my masking fluid, and right away I discover something that I didn't anticipate. There were some kind of big blobs, but I can recover from this in progress by taking my masking fluid pickup and just removing some of those big blobs before I start painting. I also didn't think very carefully about where this hillside is going to go, so I decide to just draw something in and see how it works. And I decided to make the snow lighter, but should I just do the snow or do everything? I'm not really sure, so I decide to go ahead and just paint my snow color over everything and come back and do another layer over the sky. I don't know if this is the right decision, but this is as good a way as any of answering that question, so I might as well give it a shot. After I let that layer dry, it's time to do the sky, and I'm not sure what direction to go here. Start at the top and work down, or would it be better to start at the snow and work up? I don't know, so again, the easiest way to answer that question is to give it a try. After all, it hasn't taken me a lot of work to get to this point, so if I try it and it doesn't work, then I've answered that question and I'll know what to do next time. So I may as well just go ahead and give it a shot. And here's another question I didn't anticipate. How am I going to show the difference between that distant field and the hill that's closer up? Once again, I don't really know the answer to it, but it didn't take much work to get here, so I may as well try something, and if it doesn't work, I can start over. It looks like I maybe need some shadowing in the foreground too now. Alright, let's put some in there. What's happening here, where I keep discovering things that I didn't think about and I have to go back and try something or maybe go back and do more research, is very, very common in my paintings. Now, you can try to figure all this stuff out ahead of time, but very few of us are that good at really anticipating all the things we're going to encounter. But we can answer a lot of these questions by just giving something a try and finding out if it works. So don't panic if this happens to you. Looking at this after it's dried, I don't feel like there's enough distinction between the sky and the snow, so I'll try putting another layer on the sky. And this time I'll go the other way. Maybe that'll be easier. Ultimately, even if I decide that I have to start a new draft and these fixes aren't working, I'll be in a much better position because I'll be able to refine my plan based on what I've learned by attempting this draft. Okay, it's not fabulous, but it's not horrible, so let's see what it looks like when I take the masking fluid off. Well, some of those blobs are still a bit large. I wonder what would happen if I just touch in a little color. Not bad. That seems to help. Let me do that to the places where it feels like I've got just a little bit too much white. Okay, now I'm down to adding the tree, which is the part that I was pretty confident about. So I just used those techniques I learned before and put my little tree in. Well, that looks a little pasted on. I wonder if it would be better if I made kind of a shadow. That's a little better. But the tree doesn't really stand out very well. I'm not sure I'm happy with this. Again, since I don't have a huge amount of time invested in this, I may as well experiment with it. I'm not happy with it as it is. Would I like it better if I would have had some snow on the tree? Why not put some white paint in and see what happens? Well, I do like it better with the white. It helps bring the tree into the foreground and make it more prominent, and the tree was the subject after all. I don't have any objection to putting white paint on something unless I'm going to enter it in a show where that's not allowed. So this is just a postcard. I can use white paint if I want to. So now I have two different examples of postcards that I created all on my own design. And I can choose whether I want to stick with the one that was pretty straightforward and easy, or take what I've learned in the process of making that first draft on the Starry Night and trying that one again, or maybe I like it as is. So there you have an example of how the planning process might work for a simple plan for a holiday postcard. I hope you'll take the plan that you've developed and try executing it. And don't freak out if the same thing happens to you as happened to me when I did my Starry Night postcard and you discover that there were things you didn't think of in the first plan. That's very common, very normal, and that's why I say the planning process is often kind of a messy spiral. You may be able to recover and get a first draft that you modify and like, or you may decide to take what you learned in that first draft and revise your plan and improve it and try again. Since you've done most of the work, when you do the planning process, you really are just crossing the finish line. Each time you have to revise that plan, there's really not that much work left for you in the actual execution. So it makes it pretty low stress to go ahead and give it a shot, and if it doesn't work, make some changes and try again. So I hope you'll give it a try, have fun with it, and I'll see you next time. Happy painting!